Margaret Garner's hands were still wet with her daughter's blood when the federal marshals broke down the door. That's what the Cincinnati newspapers refused to print in February 1856. Not the full truth anyway. They called it a domestic tragedy. They called it an unfortunate incident. What they didn't call it was what it actually was. The moment America's most carefully guarded lie came crashing through a frozen river and landed screaming in a courtroom where no one wanted to hear it. 28 people witnessed what happened in that small cabin on Mill Creek. Not one of them ever told the same story twice. The records were sealed. The testimonies were contradicted. The trial transcripts, those that survived, were edited so heavily they might as well have been fiction. But there's a reason Margaret Garner's name still makes historians uncomfortable. There's a reason her case was buried under legal jargon and procedural delays until most people forgot it ever happened. Because what Margaret did that winter morning didn't just challenge the law. It exposed the one truth the entire system was built to hide. And tonight, you're going to hear what they tried to erase. Before we continue with the story of Margaret Garner and the secret that nearly tore a nation apart, I need you to do something. If you're drawn to stories that uncover the darkest chapters of history, the ones they didn't want you to know, hit that subscribe button right now and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from, because this story reaches further than you think. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Kentucky, 1856. The Ohio River divided more than geography. It split the world in two. On one side, the Commonwealth of Kentucky, where human beings were property and the law said so in writing. On the other, Ohio, where freedom was supposed to mean something. But freedom, as Margaret Garner would learn, was a word that changed its meaning depending on which side of the river you stood. The river itself was a living thing, changing with the seasons. In summer it ran slow and brown, thick with sediment from the farms upstream. In winter, it froze solid enough to walk across, if you were brave enough or desperate enough to try. The ice groaned and cracked under its own weight, shifting in the darkness like something trying to wake up. People said you could hear it at night, a low moaning sound that carried across the water and into the slave quarters on both sides of the border. Some said it was just the ice. Others said it was the voices of all the people who'd tried to cross and never made it. Margaret was born enslaved on the Maplewood Plantation in Boone County around 1834. The exact date was never recorded. Slave births weren't considered important enough to document with precision. Her mother, Priscilla, had been brought there as a girl, purchased at an estate sale in Lexington when the previous owner died, and his property was liquidated. Priscilla never spoke about her own mother, about the family she'd been torn from, about the life she'd had before Maplewood. That's what slavery did. It severed you from your past so completely that eventually, you stopped trying to remember. Margaret's father. No one spoke his name aloud, but everyone knew. The master's son, Archibald K. Gaines, had a way of moving through the quarters at night, and the children born 9 months later carried his features in their faces. Margaret was one of them, light-skinned with sharp eyes that seemed to see through people, and the intelligence that made the overseers nervous. Slaves weren't supposed to think too much. Thinking led to questions. Questions led to trouble. Maplewood wasn't the largest plantation in Boone County, but it was substantial. Over 800 acres of tobacco, corn, and hemp worked by 53 enslaved people. The main house was a 2-story brick structure with white columns built in the federal style that was popular in Kentucky at the time. It sat on a hill overlooking the fields, positioned so that anyone standing on the front porch could see all the way down to the quarters, a deliberate design choice that ensured constant surveillance. The quarters themselves were a row of small cabins, each one housing multiple families. The walls were thin, the roofs leaked, and in winter the wind came through the gaps in the boards like knives. Margaret grew up in the third cabin from the end, sharing the space with her mother, 2 aunts, and 7 other children. Privacy was a luxury that didn't exist. You learned to sleep through other people's nightmares, to ignore the sounds of crying, to pretend you didn't see the bruises that appeared on your neighbors' bodies after the overseer paid a visit. She married Robert Garner when she was 19. He belonged to a neighboring plantation, the property of a man named James Marshall. But the 2 estates allowed their enslaved people to form unions. It kept them rooted, less likely to run. The ceremony wasn't legal, of course. Slave marriages had no standing under Kentucky law, but the community recognized them, and that was what mattered. They jumped the broom in front of witnesses, made promises they both knew could be broken at any moment by a master's whim, and tried to build something resembling a life. Robert was darker than Margaret, broad-shouldered, with hands scarred from years of labor in Marshall's tobacco fields. He had a quiet strength about him, the kind that came from surviving things that should have killed him. He'd been sold twice before, once as a child, separated from his mother, and again as a teenager when his first owner died, and the estate was divided among heirs. He'd learned not to get attached to places or people because attachment meant pain. But he loved Margaret the way a man loves when he knows love is all he's allowed to own. They had 4 children. Mary, the oldest, was nearly 3, a bright, curious child with her mother's eyes and her father's smile. Thomas and Samuel, the boys, were 2 and 1, still learning to walk, still young enough to believe the world was a safe place. And Priscilla, the baby, named after Margaret's mother, was only 9 months old, still nursing, still small enough to fit in the crook of Margaret's arm. Margaret loved her children with a fierceness that frightened her. She'd heard the stories, mothers who'd had their children sold away, who'd watched them dragged off to auction blocks and never seen them again. She'd seen women go mad with grief, seen them stop eating, stop speaking, stop living. She'd promised herself it would never happen to her family. She'd promised herself she would do whatever it took to keep her children safe. Life on Maplewood was what it always was, a series of days that bled into each other, marked only by the seasons and the master's moods. You woke before dawn, worked until your hands bled, ate whatever scraps you were given, and collapsed into sleep so deep it felt like drowning. Sundays were supposed to be rest days, but rest was relative. There was always mending to do, food to prepare, children to care for. The work never truly stopped. John Pollard Gaines, the plantation owner, was not the cruelest master in Kentucky. That was the worst part. He was ordinary. He didn't beat his slaves to death or starve them. He didn't sell families apart unless he had to. He simply owned them, the way a man owns a plow or a horse, and expected them to be grateful for the mercy of their chains. He attended church every Sunday, sang hymns about Christian charity, and went home to a dinner prepared by people who had no choice but to serve him. He saw no contradiction in this. Most people didn't. But in the winter of 1856, something shifted. Gaines had fallen into debt. The tobacco market had collapsed. Prices were down. And he'd made some bad investments in railroad stock that had failed to pay off. Whispers moved through the quarters. He was selling off parcels of land, liquidating assets, and assets in Kentucky, included people. Margaret heard the rumors first from Priscilla, who heard them from the house servants. Gaines was planning to sell some of his slaves south. South meant the Deep South. South meant cotton fields in Mississippi, sugar plantations in Louisiana, rice plantations in South Carolina, places where enslaved people were worked to death in 5 years and replaced with fresh bodies from the auction block. The Deep South had a reputation, and that reputation was built on bones. The fear that settled over the quarters was thick enough to taste. People stopped sleeping. They watched the main house, looking for signs, trying to guess who would be chosen. The overseer started making lists, walking through the cabins with a ledger, taking inventory. Margaret's name was on that list. So was Robert's. So were the children's. She made her decision on a January night when the temperature dropped below freezing and the Ohio River turned to ice. The plan came together in whispers, passed from cabin to cabin in the dead of night when the overseer was asleep and the dogs were quiet. Robert had made contact with a man named Elijah Kite, a free black man who lived just across the river in Cincinnati. Kite was known in the community, not openly, but in the way important things were known through coded conversations and careful silences. He helped runaways. He was part of the network, the invisible chain of safe houses and sympathetic souls that stretched from the slave states to Canada. The river had frozen solid 3 days earlier. The ice was thick enough to hold a man's weight, maybe even a wagon if you were careful. It was a rare opportunity. The river didn't freeze like this every year, and when it didn't stay frozen for long. If they were going to run, it had to be now. They left just after midnight on January 27, 1856. Margaret, Robert, their 4 children, and Robert's parents, Simon and Mary, both in their 60s. Both too old to be running through the night, but too afraid of being sold to stay behind. 9 people in total, moving through the darkness like shadows, fleeing the light. Margaret carried baby Priscilla wrapped in a thin blanket, the only one they had. The cold was brutal, the kind that burned your lungs when you breathed and turned your fingers numb in minutes. Mary held Robert's hand, her small legs struggling to keep up. Thomas and Samuel were carried by their grandparents, bundled against the cold, their faces barely visible beneath layers of cloth. They moved in silence. Sound carried at night, especially in winter when the air was still and the world was frozen. A dog's bark could mean discovery. A child's cry could mean death. Margaret had given the children a mixture of herbs earlier, something Priscilla had taught her, something that would keep them drowsy and quiet. It was dangerous. Too much could kill them, but not as dangerous as being caught. The field stretched out around them, empty and white under the moonlight. The tobacco stalks had been cut down months ago, leaving only stubble and frozen earth. In the distance, the main house sat dark and silent, its windows like empty eyes watching them go. Margaret didn't look back. Looking back was bad luck. Looking back meant you weren't committed. Looking back meant you might change your mind. They reached the river just before 1 in the morning. The ice stretched out before them, a vast expanse of black glass that reflected the stars. It looked solid, but Margaret knew better. Ice was deceptive. It could hold you one moment and swallow you the next. People had died trying to cross this river. Their bodies were found in spring when the ice melted, bloated, and unrecognizable, washed up on the banks like driftwood. Robert went first, testing the ice with each step, listening for the telltale crack that meant danger. The ice groaned beneath him, a deep sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. He motioned for the others to follow, spacing themselves out to distribute the weight. Margaret stepped onto the ice, feeling it shift beneath her feet, and started walking. The crossing took 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. Every step was a prayer. Every breath was a gamble. The baby stirred in Margaret's arms, making small sounds, and Margaret held her closer, whispering soothing words that were carried away by the wind. Mary slipped once, her feet going out from under her, and Robert caught her before she hit the ice. The sound of her near-fall echoed across the river like a gunshot, and they all froze, waiting to see if anyone had heard. No one came. The Kentucky shore remained dark and silent. They kept moving. They made it across. That was the first miracle. Margaret's feet touched Ohio soil. Free soil, they called it, though she didn't feel free yet. And she allowed herself one moment of relief, one moment to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were going to survive this. The second miracle was that Elijah Kite's house was exactly where they'd been told it would be. A small cabin on Mill Creek, just outside Cincinnati, tucked back from the road and hidden by trees. Kite opened the door before they could knock, as if he'd been waiting for them. He was a tall man, thin with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. He ushered them inside without a word, closed the door, and bolted it. The cabin was small, just 2 rooms, but it was warm. A fire burned in the hearth, and the smell of food, real food, not the scraps they were used to, filled the air. Kite's wife, a woman named Sarah, brought them bread and soup, and they ate in silence, too exhausted to speak. The children fell asleep almost immediately, curled up on blankets near the fire. Robert's parents sat in the corner holding hands, their faces blank with shock. They'd made it. Against all odds, they'd actually made it. Kite told them the plan. They would rest for a few hours, then leave at dawn for the next station, a farm about 20 Medidyedamin north, owned by a Quaker family who would hide them in a false-bottom wagon and take them further up the line. From there, it was a series of jumps, each one bringing them closer to Canada. It would take weeks, maybe months, but it was possible. People did it all the time. They could do it too. Margaret allowed herself to hope just a little, just enough to imagine a future where her children grew up free, where they learned to read and write, where they chose their own paths. It was a dangerous thing, hope. It made you vulnerable. But in that moment, in that warm cabin with her family safe around her, she let herself believe. She shouldn't have. The knock came at dawn. Not a polite knock, a pounding aggressive, the sound of fists and rifle butts against wood. Voices shouted from outside, demanding entry, invoking the law. Margaret's eyes snapped open, and she knew immediately what had happened. Someone had seen them. Someone had talked. Someone had sold them out. Robert was already on his feet, moving toward the door, trying to bar it, but it was too late. The door splintered open, torn from its hinges, and the marshals poured in like a flood. There were 6 of them, all white men, all armed, all wearing the badges that gave them the authority to drag human beings back into bondage. Behind them, standing in the doorway with expressions of grim satisfaction, were John Pollard Gaines and James Marshall. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was clear. Runaways had no rights. They could be seized without trial, without testimony, without defense. The law didn't care if you'd made it to Ohio. The law didn't care if you'd touched free soil. The law said you were property, and property had to be returned to its rightful owner. One of the marshals grabbed Robert, slamming him against the wall. Another went for Simon, who tried to resist and was struck across the face with a rifle butt. Mary screamed. The baby started crying. The cabin erupted into chaos, bodies and voices and the smell of fear. Margaret moved faster than anyone expected. She grabbed a butcher knife from the table, a long, heavy blade that Kite's wife had been using to cut bread, and turned toward her children. Later, witnesses would argue about what happened next. Some said she screamed. Others said she was silent, but everyone agreed on what she did. She grabbed Mary by the arm, pulled her close, and slit her throat. The blood came fast, a bright red arc that sprayed across the cabin wall and splattered onto the floor. Mary's body went limp in Margaret's arms, her small hands reaching up toward her mother's face, her eyes wide with confusion. And then nothing. The marshals froze, too shocked to move. The room went silent, except for the sound of blood dripping onto the wooden floor, a steady rhythm like a clock ticking. Margaret turned toward the other children, the knife still in her hand, her face expressionless. She moved toward Thomas, reaching for him, and that's when the marshals recovered. Two of them tackled her to the ground, slamming her face first into the floor. The knife skidded away, leaving a trail of blood. Robert lunged forward, trying to reach her, but he was beaten back, struck repeatedly until he collapsed. Simon and Mary were dragged into the corner. The baby was pulled from Sarah Kite's arms, screaming. Margaret didn't fight. She lay on the floor, her hands pinned behind her back, her face pressed against the wood, and stared at her daughter's body. Mary's blood was pooling around her, spreading slowly, soaking into the cracks between the floorboards. Her eyes were still open, staring at nothing. One of the marshals, a man named John Joliffe, stood over Margaret and demanded to know what she'd done. Margaret looked up at him, her face covered in blood, some of it Mary's, some of it her own from where she'd been struck, and said the words that would haunt the nation for decades. "I will not let them take my children back into slavery. I will kill them all first." The room erupted again. Gaines was shouting, demanding that Margaret be restrained, that the other children be secured. Marshall was yelling at the marshals, accusing them of incompetence. Elijah Kite was trying to explain, trying to defend himself, saying he didn't know. He had no idea she would do something like this, but his words were drowned out by the chaos. Mary's body was covered with a blanket. The other children were gathered up, still crying, still reaching for their mother. Margaret was dragged to her feet, her hands bound with rope and led outside. A crowd had gathered, neighbors, curious onlookers, people who'd heard the commotion and come to see what was happening. They stared at Margaret as she was loaded into a wagon, their faces a mixture of horror and fascination. The newspapers would later describe the scene as a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. They would call Margaret a monster, a madwoman, a cautionary tale of what happened when enslaved people were given ideas above their station. But in that moment, as the wagon pulled away and Margaret looked back at the cabin where her daughter's body still lay, she felt nothing. No regret, no grief, just a cold, empty certainty that she had done the right thing because she knew what slavery was. She'd lived it, she'd survived it, and she knew with a certainty that no free person could ever understand, that death was a mercy. The trial began on January 28, 1856, less than 24 hours after Mary's death. It should have been straightforward. Under the Fugitive Slave Act, Margaret and her family were property, and property didn't get trials. They were to be returned to their owners immediately, no questions asked, no delays permitted. The law was designed to be fast and efficient, to discourage runaways by making escape functionally impossible. But something unexpected happened. Ohio charged Margaret with murder. It was a legal paradox that no one had anticipated. If Margaret was property, as the federal law claimed, then she couldn't be charged with murder. Property couldn't commit crimes. Animals didn't stand trial when they killed. Tools didn't face justice when they caused harm. If Margaret was a thing, then what she'd done was no different than a plow breaking or a horse going lame. But if she was a person capable of standing trial, capable of being held accountable for her actions, then she couldn't be property. The case became a battleground, not over Margaret's guilt, but over her humanity. The courtroom was packed from the first day. The trial was held in the Hamilton County Courthouse in Cincinnati, a grand building with marble columns and high ceilings that made every word echo. Abolitionists saw Margaret as a symbol, a mother driven to the unthinkable by the horrors of slavery. Proof that the institution was so evil it turned human beings into monsters. Pro-slavery advocates saw her as proof that enslaved people were violent, irrational, unfit for freedom, dangerous if not kept under control. The newspapers ran daily updates, each one more sensational than the last. Margaret's face appeared in sketches, her expression blank, unreadable. She didn't cry, she didn't plead, she simply sat in the defendant's chair and waited. Her lawyer was a man named John Joliffe, a prominent abolitionist attorney who'd made a career out of defending runaways. He was in his 50s with gray hair and a voice that could fill a room. He'd argued dozens of fugitive slave cases, won some, lost most, but never stopped fighting. He saw Margaret's case as an opportunity, not just to save her life, but to expose the fundamental contradiction at the heart of American slavery. Joliffe's argument was simple. Margaret should be tried for murder in Ohio, not returned to Kentucky. If she was convicted, she would hang, but she would hang as a free woman recognized by the law as a human being with agency and accountability. If she was returned to Kentucky, she would live, but she would live as property, and her surviving children would remain enslaved. It was a choice between death with dignity and life in chains. Margaret made her choice clear. She wanted the murder trial. She wanted to hang. The prosecution was led by federal attorneys working on behalf of Gaines and Marshall. Their argument was equally simple. Margaret was property. The Fugitive Slave Act superseded state law. She had no right to a trial. She had no rights at all. The murder charge was irrelevant because the victim, Mary, was also property, and one piece of property couldn't murder another. It was a legal impossibility. The trial dragged on for weeks. Witnesses were called. Testimonies were given. Legal precedents were cited. The marshals who'd been present at the cabin described what they'd seen, their accounts varying wildly depending on who was asking. Some said Margaret had been calm, methodical, clearly in control of her actions. Others said she'd been hysterical, screaming out of her mind with fear. Elijah Kite testified that he'd had no idea Margaret was planning violence, that he'd only been trying to help a family in need. Gaines testified that Margaret had always been trouble, that she'd been insolent and disobedient, that he'd been planning to sell her south because she was a bad influence on the other slaves. Margaret herself was not allowed to testify. Under both federal and Kentucky law, enslaved people could not give testimony in court. Their words had no legal weight. They could be spoken about, but not heard. So Margaret sat in silence day after day, listening to people debate her humanity as if she weren't there. The abolitionists rallied around her. Harriet Beer Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, attended the trial and later wrote about Margaret in her diary, calling her a woman of extraordinary courage and tragic circumstance. Frederick Douglass published an editorial in his newspaper, the North Star, arguing that Margaret's actions were a damning indictment of slavery itself. What kind of system, he wrote, drives a mother to kill her own child rather than see that child enslaved? What kind of nation allows such a system to exist? But the pro-slavery press painted a different picture. The Louisville Courier called Margaret a savage and a beast in human form. The Richmond Enquirer argued that her actions proved enslaved. People were incapable of civilized behavior, that they needed the firm hand of slavery to keep them in check. This is what happens, one editorial read. When Negroes are given ideas above their station, they become dangerous, not just to themselves, but to society at large. Oh, the debate raged in newspapers, in churches, in homes across the country. Margaret Garner became a symbol, but no one could agree on what she symbolized. Was she a victim or a villain? A martyr or a murderer? A human being or a piece of property? On February 26, 1856, after nearly a month of arguments, the judge ruled. Margaret and her family were to be returned to Kentucky. The murder charge was dismissed. The Fugitive Slave Act took precedence over state law. The federal government had won. But the story didn't end there. The abolitionists weren't finished. They filed appeals, wrote letters to every politician they could reach, published editorials demanding justice. Margaret's case became a rallying cry. Am I not a woman and a sister? Read the pamphlets showing Margaret's face alongside images of shackled hands. The question was rhetorical, but the answer, according to the law, was no. Joliffe tried everything. He argued that the Fugitive Slave Act was unconstitutional, that it violated Ohio's sovereignty, that it contradicted the principles of natural law. He cited the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bible. He brought in expert witnesses, philosophers, theologians, anyone who might sway the court. But the law was clear, and the law didn't care about philosophy or theology. The law said Margaret was property, and property had to be returned. Gaines and Marshall took Margaret and her family back across the river in early March. The plan was to sell them south as quickly as possible, get rid of the evidence, erase the scandal, move on. But the abolitionists had made Margaret famous, and fame complicated things. Selling her openly would cause an uproar, so Gaines decided to wait to let the attention die down before making his move. Margaret spent the next 2 months back at Maplewood, locked in a cabin under constant guard. She wasn't allowed to work in the fields or interact with the other slaves. She was kept isolated, a prisoner in the place she'd tried so desperately to escape. Robert and the children were kept separate, housed on Marshall's plantation, forbidden from seeing her. It was a punishment, a way of breaking her spirit, of making her regret what she'd done. But Margaret didn't regret it. She'd saved Mary, that's what she told herself over and over in the darkness of that cabin. She'd saved her daughter from a life of rape and brutality and endless labor. She'd given her the only gift she had left to give, an escape. In March 1856, Gaines made his decision. He would sell Margaret, Robert, and the 3 surviving children to a plantation in the Deep South. The buyer was a man named Judge Bonham, who owned a cotton plantation in Mississippi. The sale was arranged quietly without public announcement to avoid attracting attention. Margaret and her family were to be transported by steamboat down the Ohio River to the Mississippi, then south to New Orleans, where they would be transferred to Bonham's custody. On March 22, 1856, Margaret, Robert, and their 3 children were loaded onto a steamboat called the Henry Louis. The boat was carrying a cargo of cotton, livestock, and human beings. 37 enslaved people in total, all being transported south to new owners. Margaret was kept in chains, her hands and feet shackled to prevent any attempt at escape or violence. Robert was chained separately. The children were left unrestrained, but they were watched constantly. The Henry Louis departed Cincinnati at dawn, heading downriver. The Ohio River was high with spring runoff, the current fast and dangerous. The boat moved quickly, its paddle wheel churning the brown water, its smokestacks belching black smoke into the gray sky. Margaret stood on the deck watching the shoreline pass by and thought about the river, about how close they'd come to freedom, about how the same water that had carried them toward hope was now carrying them toward hell. Somewhere near Louisville, just after midnight on March 23rd, the Henry Louis collided with another steamboat, the Edward Howard. The collision was violent. The Edward Howard struck the Henry Louis broadside, tearing a hole in its hull and sending passengers and cargo tumbling into the water. The impact threw Margaret off her feet, and she fell hard against the deck railing. The chains on her wrists and ankles made it impossible to catch herself, and she tumbled over the side, plunging into the cold, dark water below. She was still holding baby Priscilla. Witnesses later testified that Margaret had jumped. Others said she'd been knocked overboard by the collision, but everyone agreed on what happened next. Margaret held the baby underwater until she stopped struggling. By the time they were pulled from the river by crew members who jumped in after them, Priscilla was dead. Margaret was dragged back onto the boat soaking wet, her chains weighing her down, her face expressionless. She didn't resist. She didn't explain. She simply stared at the water as the boat continued south, leaving Priscilla's body behind to be recovered later by local authorities. The newspapers reported it as an accident. The official records listed Priscilla's death as drowning due to collision. No charges were filed. No investigation was conducted. Margaret had done it again, killed her own child, and this time no one even pretended to care because by then she was in the Deep South, where the law was even less interested in the lives of enslaved people than it had been in Kentucky. Margaret was sold to Judge Bonham's plantation in Issaquena County, Mississippi, one of the richest and deadliest cotton-producing regions in the South. The plantation was massive, over 3,000 acres worked by 200 enslaved people. The mortality rate was staggering. Enslaved people lasted an average of 7 years in the Mississippi Delta before they died from disease, exhaustion, or violence. The land was fertile, but it was also a swamp thick with mosquitoes and disease, malaria, yellow fever, cholera. They swept through the slave quarters every summer, killing dozens at a time. Robert and the 2 boys, Thomas and Samuel, were sold separately. Robert was purchased by a plantation owner in Arkansas. Thomas and Samuel were sold to a man in Louisiana. The family was scattered across the Deep South, never to see each other again. That was standard practice. Separating families made them easier to control, less likely to resist. If you had nothing left to lose, you had nothing left to fight for. Margaret was put to work in the fields. Cotton picking was brutal labor. You worked from dawn until well after dark, bent over in the sun, your hands bleeding from the sharp bowls, your back screaming in pain. The overseers were ruthless. They carried whips and used them liberally. If you didn't meet your quota, 100 pounds of cotton per day, you were beaten. If you talked back, you were beaten. If you looked at an overseer the wrong way, you were beaten. The violence was constant, casual, a fact of life. But Margaret didn't break. She worked in silence, her face blank, her movements mechanical. She didn't make friends. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She simply existed day after day, going through the motions of survival without any real hope of living. The other enslaved people on the plantation whispered about her. They knew her story. Word had spread through the underground network of communication that connected plantations across the South. They knew she'd killed her children rather than let them be enslaved. Some admired her for it, others were horrified. But everyone understood because they all knew what slavery was. They all knew what it did to people. Margaret lasted less than a year. In the summer of 1857, a cholera outbreak swept through the plantation. Dozens of people died, their bodies buried in unmarked graves at the edge of the property. Margaret contracted the disease in late August. She was sick for 3 weeks, burning with fever, unable to keep food down, her body wasting away. The plantation doctor, a white man who treated enslaved people the way a veterinarian treats livestock, didn't bother trying to save her. Cholera was a death sentence, and enslaved people weren't worth the cost of medicine. Margaret died on September 14, 1857. She was 23 years old. Her death was recorded in a single line in the plantation ledger. Margaret, deceased, cholera. No grave was marked, no funeral was held. Her body was wrapped in a sheet and buried in the same mass grave as the others who died that summer. She simply disappeared the way so many enslaved people disappeared, erased from history as thoroughly as if they'd never existed. But Margaret's story didn't disappear. The trial transcripts, though heavily edited, survived. The newspaper articles, though biased, were preserved. And the question she'd forced the nation to confront, whether an enslaved mother had the right to choose death over bondage for her children, lingered long after her body was buried in an unmarked grave. Abolitionists invoked her name in speeches. Harriet Beecher Stowe cited Margaret's case as inspiration for her later work, writing about the impossible choices slavery forced on mothers. Frederick Douglass wrote about her in his autobiography, calling her a woman who loved her children more than life itself. William Lloyd Garrison published editorials demanding that her story be remembered, that her sacrifice not be forgotten. But the pro-slavery press painted her as a monster, a cautionary tale of what happened when enslaved people were given ideas above their station. The Charleston Mercury ran an editorial arguing that Margaret's actions proved black people were inherently violent and needed the civilizing influence of slavery. The New Orleans Picayune called her an example of savage barbarism and used her case to argue against abolition. The Civil War came 4 years after Margaret's death. Slavery was abolished in 1865, but the question Margaret had asked, whether freedom was worth dying for, whether death was preferable to bondage, was never truly answered. It was buried along with her body in the soil of a country that didn't want to remember. What the history books don't tell you is that Margaret Garner's case set off a chain reaction that nobody anticipated. Her trial became a flashpoint, a moment when the carefully constructed legal fiction of slavery, the idea that human beings could be property, collided with reality in a way that couldn't be ignored. In the months following her return to Kentucky, abolitionist groups across the North used her case as propaganda. They printed pamphlets with her face on them, distributed them at churches and town halls, used her story to recruit new members to the cause. This is what slavery does. The pamphlets read, "This is the system you are supporting with your silence." In the South, the reaction was equally strong but opposite. Pro-slavery politicians used Margaret as evidence that enslaved people were dangerous, that they needed to be controlled more strictly, that any loosening of the laws would lead to violence and chaos. New legislation was proposed in Kentucky and other border states, tightening restrictions on enslaved people's movements, increasing penalties for those who helped runaways, making it even harder to escape. The case also exposed deep divisions within the abolitionist movement itself. Some abolitionists celebrated Margaret as a hero, a woman who'd made the ultimate sacrifice to save her children from slavery. Others were uncomfortable with that narrative, worried that glorifying infanticide would hurt the cause, would give ammunition to pro-slavery advocates who argued that black people were violent and univilized. There were heated debates in abolitionist newspapers and at meetings. Some argued that Margaret's actions were justified, that she'd done the only thing she could do in an impossible situation. Others argued that she should have trusted in God, that she should have had faith that freedom would come eventually, that killing her children was a sin no matter the circumstances. But what none of them understood, what none of them could understand because they'd never been enslaved, was that Margaret hadn't acted out of desperation or madness. She'd acted out of knowledge. She knew exactly what slavery was. She'd lived it every day of her life. She'd been raped by her master's son. She'd watched her mother be raped. She'd seen children torn from their mother's arms and sold to men who worked them to death. She'd seen women beaten until they miscarried, men hanged for the crime of learning to read, families destroyed because a master needed cash to pay his debts. She knew what awaited her children if they were taken back to Kentucky. She knew what awaited them if they were sold south, and she'd made a calculation that no free person could ever truly understand. That death was better. That a quick death at her own hands surrounded by love was better than a slow death in the fields surrounded by cruelty. The legal system couldn't process that calculation. The law was built on the assumption that life was always preferable to death, that survival was always the goal. But Margaret had rejected that assumption. She'd said with her actions, if not her words, that some lives weren't worth living, that some forms of survival were worse than death, and that terrified people. Because if Margaret was right, if death was better than slavery, then the entire system was built on a lie. And no one, not the slaveholders, not the politicians, not even the abolitionists, wanted to admit that. Here's what they didn't tell you in the history books. Here's what the trial transcripts left out. What the newspapers refused to print. What the abolitionists and the slaveholders both agreed to keep quiet. Margaret Garner didn't kill her daughter in a moment of madness. She didn't act out of desperation or panic. She killed Mary because she knew exactly what slavery was. She'd lived it. She'd survived it. And she knew with a certainty that no free person could ever understand that death was a mercy. The night before they ran, Margaret had made a promise to herself. If they were caught, if they were taken back, she would not let her children suffer what she had suffered. She would not let them be raped, beaten, worked to death. She would not let them live as property. She would give them the only gift she had left to give, an escape. When the marshals broke down the door, Margaret didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the consequences, didn't consider alternatives, didn't pray for a miracle. She simply acted because she'd already made her decision, and she'd made it with full knowledge of what it meant. She killed Mary first because Mary was the oldest, the one who would remember, the one who would understand eventually what had been done to her. Margaret wanted to spare her that understanding. She wanted to spare her the knowledge of what it meant to be enslaved, to be owned, to be used. She tried to kill the others too. That's what the witnesses didn't want to say, what the trial transcripts glossed over. Margaret didn't just kill Mary and then stop. She went for Thomas next, grabbed him by the arm, raised the knife. But the marshals tackled her before she could finish. If they'd been 1 second slower, Thomas would have died too. And Samuel and baby Priscilla. Margaret told her lawyer later in a conversation that was never made public that she regretted not being faster. She regretted that the marshals had stopped her because she knew what was coming. She knew her children would be sold south, separated, worked to death in the cotton fields. She knew they would suffer, and she knew she wouldn't be there to protect them. "I should have been quicker," she told Joliffe. "I should have killed them all." Joliffe didn't know what to say to that. He was an abolitionist, a man who dedicated his life to fighting slavery, but he'd never been enslaved. He'd never had to make the choice Margaret had made. He couldn't understand it, not really, so he just nodded and promised to do everything he could to save her. But he couldn't save her. No one could, because the law didn't recognize her as a person. The law said she was property, and property couldn't be saved. It could only be returned to its owner. The truth is, Margaret Garner exposed the fundamental lie at the heart of American slavery. The lie that enslaved people were content, that they were happy, that they were better off in bondage than in freedom. The lie that slavery was a benevolent institution, that masters were kind, that families were kept together, that violence was rare. Margaret proved that lie false. She proved it with a butcher knife and her daughter's blood. She proved it by choosing death over slavery, not just for herself, but for her children. She proved it by forcing the nation to confront a question it didn't want to answer. If slavery was so benevolent, why would a mother kill her own child rather than let that child be enslaved? The abolitionists understood this, even if they didn't want to say it out loud. That's why they rallied around Margaret, why they made her a symbol. Because her actions were an indictment of the entire system. They were proof that slavery was so evil, so brutal, so dehumanizing, that death was preferable. But the pro-slavery advocates understood it too. That's why they worked so hard to paint Margaret as a monster, as an aberration, as proof that black people were violent and needed to be controlled. Because if Margaret was right, if her actions were justified, then slavery couldn't be justified, and they couldn't allow that. So they buried her story. They edited the trial transcripts, suppressed the testimonies, dismissed the murder charge. They sent her south where she died in obscurity, and they hoped the world would forget. But the world didn't forget, not completely, because Margaret Garner's question whether death is better than slavery is a question that can't be buried. It's a question that haunts us still. Margaret Garner's grave has never been found. There's no headstone, no memorial, no marker to show where she was buried. The plantation where she died was sold and resold, the land repurposed, the records lost. The mass grave where her body was buried was plowed over decades ago, turned into farmland, then later into a shopping center. She exists now only in fragments, trial transcripts, newspaper clippings, abolitionist pamphlets, and the fading memories of a nation that tried to forget her. But her question remains, the one she asked with a butcher knife in a cabin on Mill Creek, the one she asked again in the cold waters of the Mississippi River, the one America still hasn't answered. Was she a murderer or a mother? A monster or a martyr? Property or a person? The law said she was property. History says she was a symbol. But Margaret Garner knew what she was. She was a woman who loved her children enough to kill them. And that's the secret America wanted to erase. Because if we acknowledge that Margaret was right, that death was better than slavery, then we have to acknowledge what slavery really was, not the sanitized version taught in schools, not the romanticized version shown in movies, but the real thing, the rape, the brutality, the families torn apart, the children sold away, the endless labor, the constant violence, the complete and total dehumanization. We have to acknowledge that millions of people lived through that they survived it or didn't survive it, and that their suffering was real and profound and unimaginable. We have to acknowledge that the country we live in was built on that suffering, that the wealth and power of America came from the bodies of enslaved people who were worked to death and replaced with fresh bodies from the auction block. And that's uncomfortable. It's easier to forget. It's easier to bury the story, to edit the transcripts, to dismiss Margaret as an aberration. It's easier to pretend that slavery wasn't that bad, that most masters were kind, that most enslaved people were content. But Margaret Garner won't let us forget. Her story won't let us forget. Because she made a choice that forces us to confront the truth. She chose death over slavery. She chose it for her children, and she tried to choose it for herself. And that choice is an indictment that can't be erased. In 1867, 10 years after Margaret's death, a woman named Lucy Stone gave a speech at the American Anti-Slavery Society convention. She spoke about Margaret Garner, about the trial, about the question that had never been answered. "We talk about the evils of slavery," Stone said, "but we don't talk about the worst evil. The worst evil is that it makes death preferable to life. It makes a mother kill her own child. And if we can't understand that, if we can't acknowledge that, then we haven't learned anything." The audience sat in silence because Stone was right. They hadn't learned anything, and in many ways, we still haven't. Margaret Garner's story was buried, but it wasn't forgotten. It resurfaced during the civil rights movement when activists used her case to illustrate the horrors of slavery. It resurfaced again in the 1980s when Toni Morrison wrote Beloved, a novel inspired by Margaret's story. Morrison understood what Margaret had done, understood the impossible choice she'd made, and she wrote about it with a clarity and compassion that the newspapers of 1856 could never have managed. Beloved won the Pulitzer Prize. It became required reading in schools across the country. And through it, Margaret Garner's story reached a new generation. People who'd never heard of the trial, who didn't know about the Fugitive Slave Act, who couldn't imagine what it was like to be enslaved, read Morrison's novel and understood at least a little bit what Margaret had done and why. But even Morrison's novel couldn't fully capture it, because the truth is, no one who hasn't been enslaved can truly understand. No one who hasn't lived through that level of dehumanization, that level of brutality, can truly comprehend the choice Margaret made. We can sympathize, we can try to understand, but we can't know. And maybe that's the point. Maybe Margaret's story isn't meant to be understood. Maybe it's meant to be a reminder of what slavery was, a reminder of what human beings are capable of doing to each other, a reminder that freedom isn't free, that it's bought with blood and suffering and impossible choices. Margaret Garner died alone in a Mississippi cotton field, her body buried in an unmarked grave, her children scattered across the South, her family destroyed, but her question lives on. It lives on in every discussion about slavery, every debate about reparations, every argument about how we teach history. It lives on because it can't be answered. It can only be asked over and over until we finally have the courage to face it. Was death better than slavery? Margaret Garner said yes, and America has been trying to prove her wrong ever since. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Margaret Garner was a hero or a villain? Was she right to do what she did, or was there another way? Leave your comment below.